The Volatile Vaal Orb is one of the more interesting additions to Path of Exile in recent leagues. This is a currency item that corrupts a unique equipment item with a 50% chance to destroy it, and if it survives that 50-50 flip, the modifiers on the item will be divine just like a normal divine orb, and it will then have a random magnitude multiplier applied to each modifier individually, and this multiplier rolls between 0.78 and 1.22, effectively allowing rolls to exceed their normal minimums and maximums by up to 22%, or in some cases even more because the Volatile Vaal Orb outcome can round up or down, unlike most other mechanics which pretty much always round down. Now in this video I wanted to cover some uniques that can have very powerful outcomes if you get a very lucky Volatile Vaal Orb, but ones that are perhaps a little bit overlooked for several reasons. So let's just get straight into it, beginning with the Coward's Wail. Now this is a shield that was added quite recently, I think it came into the game a few patches back, and this one basically solves a problem that totem builds have in the endgame, which is that when you get to really difficult content, very juiced maps and things like Uber bosses, and maybe even just some normal pinnacle bosses, your totems kind of just fall over immediately to any kind of damage coming towards them. And that's because totems are generally quite squishy unless you really invest into their tankiness. So this has a modifier which says, totems which would be killed by enemies become spectral totems for 8 seconds instead. And then it says that skills used by spectral totems deal less damage, and there's a maximum summoned number of spectral totems there as well. So usually this can roll up to a maximum of 5 spectral totems, and then it can roll down to those spectral totems dealing 40% less damage. Now spectral totems are essentially normal totems, except for they don't share the limit with normal totems, they're kind of a separate entity, and when you have a spectral totem, they basically cannot be targeted, they don't take any damage, and they just sit there dealing their damage for their duration. And all of your normal totem modifiers apply to these totems. They are essentially just like normal totems, except for, they're not sharing that limit, and they have these extra modifiers being applied to them here, like this less damage. So usually you can have a maximum of 5 spectral totems, and then you can also have that less damage multiplier rolling down to 40% less, which means with a perfect normal Coward's Wail that's uncorrupted, you would be able to have a maximum of 5 spectral totems, which would each be dealing 60% of their normal damage. Therefore, you would have an effective 3 extra totems when you actually have those out, right? 5 totems dealing 60% of their normal damage, which is pretty good. You can see how that would compete against a normal crafted totem shield, which would add, +1 to maximum totems, and maybe some other modifiers there like double damage or spell crit and spell damage and things like that. However, a Volatile Vaal Orb can seriously improve this item and make it really, really strong, because the maximum spectral totems can roll up to 6, that's already very good on its own, but it can also tag the less damage multiplier there as well, and that can go down to as low as 31% less. It also tags the duration modifier there as well, so that could maybe get a little bit of extra duration for the summoned totems, but that one's not quite as relevant. So with the 6 spectral totems, and if you're able to get lucky as well there with the less damage modifier, you could actually get up to an effective 4 extra totems or even a little bit more, because you then have 6 totems dealing up to 69% of their normal damage, which is really quite strong. And obviously it is very, very difficult to actually get this to these particular stats here, so you do need to get really lucky there for that to happen, but that is an item that can be ridiculous with a very lucky outcome. Now next up we have Bitter Instinct. So this is, I believe it's an Uber boss drop, I think it comes from the Incarnation of Neglect, if I remember correctly. And this is an interesting shield. I don't think it really had the impact that they probably wished, because it didn't get used all that much, but it's an item that essentially enables retaliation skills without the need to block incoming hits. It says damaging retaliation skills become usable every 4 seconds. So it also allows those skills to actually be usable for longer, but mostly you're gaining a way to actually use your skills without needing to proc an incoming block or other kind of effects to actually, be able to use that retaliation skill. Now importantly, this does only apply to damaging retaliation skills, so you won't be able to use things like Vengeful Cry, for example, because that's not a damaging retaliation skill. And this one rolls down to as low as 3.12 seconds with a very, very lucky Volatile Vaal Orb outcome. And I wanted to discuss this one because I think it's quite interesting, the idea of using this with, a good Vaal Orb outcome there. And then you actually go for either a champion or a slayer. And you can take the measured retaliation node from the gladiator over onto this class, and then obviously you don't need any of the block stuff because you're not speccing into block, you're not relying on block to actually activate those retaliation skills. Then you can also consider anointing No Forgiveness, which is a combined 70% total chance for retaliation skills to remain usable, which means you can basically, spam skills a little bit more. So that's potentially a use case there for that shield, though I haven't really seen people use it all that often. And I think that the Bitter Instinct shield is particularly interesting in a setup where you use retaliation skills as a hit-based ability rather than damage over time, because in a lot of cases there's a lot of Ignite builds with Eviscerate, there's a lot of Bleed builds with Eviscerate, and hit-based retaliation skills are really quite awkward because you kind of get in this situation where you can't really use any of your skills because you're just waiting for things to happen. So it might be the case that that's quite an interesting idea there, where you make use of Bitter Instinct to actually be able to, use those damaging retaliation skills without actually waiting for incoming blocked hits. Next up, we have the Replica Midnight Bargain. Now, I haven't got too much to say about this one, I just wanted to mention it because this is an interesting item along with the transfigured version of Summon Raging Spirit. I think it's called Summon Raging Spirit of Enormity, which only has a maximum minion count of 6 normally. So this item already adds 6, so you immediately double the amount of minions you can actually summon with that skill. And with a Volatile Vaal Orb, that can actually roll up to 7. But I think the more interesting thing here is that the reservation, the life reservation there, which is usually 30%, can roll down to as low as 23%. And that means that, you may be able to fit an extra reservation in there against your life if you're doing some kind of low life build or something like that. So that may have a use case there with some kind of popcorn SRS setup. And next up we have Pragmatism, which is a unique body armor. I really, really like this one actually with the Volatile Vaal Orb. So this item usually has plus 12 to level of socketed skill gems, and then for each gem you actually socket into the body armor, you lose 2 of those gem levels. Now, the plus 12 can actually roll up to plus 15 gem levels with a good Volatile Vaal Orb outcome, and that is a lot of gem levels. And I wanted to mention this one in particular because of a setup that I believe That's Real Nito made a build way back in Affliction League, I think, whenever this unique body arm was actually first added to the game. And he made a build with Spellslinger and Ball Lightning of Static using this body armor. Now, the idea behind that was the fact that Spellslinger, even though it is a support, it's also counted as a skill, and it gains the skill gem levels from this body armor. And that's important because Spellslinger scales very, very well with gem levels. 3 particular stats are tagged. You get the increased cooldown recovery rate for supported skills, that goes up. You also get the added spell damage based on your wand damage, that one scales up, and also the less damage with hits and ailments from supported skills goes down as well. So you can actually see there, if I was to set this up, this currently has plus 11 gem levels, so if I was to set this to a normal level 20 gem, you can see that the less damage there is 20%, and the added damage is, 194% of equipped wand, and then you also have 38% increased cooldown recovery rate. So scaling up by 11 gem levels, you're actually gaining quite a lot out of that. And the build that Nito actually played in that particular league was Ball Lightning of Static, because this has a cooldown time, and of course Spellslinger can lower that cooldown because it has that increased cooldown recovery rate of supported skills, and you can basically have a setup there where you're able to just spam out this skill constantly because you have such a low cooldown. 11 gem levels is absolutely absurd, but you do of course have the downside of Pragmatism being a pretty terrible body armor, and body armors are really, really competitive, so that is something that you have to address. Next up we have the Beacon of Madness. Now I wanted to just mention this one because maximum fortification is something that is pretty hard to get, and usually it takes a lot of, expensive gear, things like the Celestial Embrace, for example, from the Exile, which is another item that can go pretty ridiculous with Volatile Vaal Orbs, but that one is exceptionally expensive. This one always rolls plus 15 to maximum fortification, so you don't have to kind of worry about that first part where the item gets divined. And that means that you are more likely to actually get a better outcome on this, and it can roll up to plus 18 to maximum fortification, which is really quite good. Beacon of Madness is already pretty good off. They changed that skill there so that it applies debuffs at a lower rate, and that is just an interesting item you could look at there to kind of stack up a lot of maximum fortification, perhaps on a champion or something like that. And the last item that I wanted to talk about in this video is Replica Emberwake. Now, this is that kind of classic ring there which baits people a little bit in PoB because it always looks like it's dealing a ridiculous amount of damage, but what it's doing is completely killing the duration of your ignite. Usually this is a 90% reduced duration, and then you also have the inflicted ignites dealing damage faster, so it ends up making it so your ignite basically has barely any duration. It just deals a bunch of damage very, very quickly. And you can actually get this lowered down to 70% reduced duration of ignite on enemies with a very good Volatile Vaal Orb outcome. And I wanted to mention this one because you're still going to be able to benefit from that ignites dealing their damage faster, which is a very strong stat. And you can basically counter this 70% reduced ignite duration here with just one level 20% quality Unbound Ailment, which already has 64% increased duration of ailments inflicted with supported skills. Those stats are additive, so you have the reduced ignite duration there on the ring, and this one is increased duration of ailments. So those things are additive, and so you can basically cancel that downside out, and then you get that really strong ignites dealing damage faster modifier there, which can also get affected by the Volatile Vaal outcome, so you may get a little bit unlucky with that, or perhaps you get lucky with it, who knows. But that's going to be it for this video. I just wanted to cover a few underrated or perhaps underutilized Volatile Vaal Orb uniques. Some of them are still going to be very expensive to get ones with good rolls, but I think they're all quite serviceable, and in some cases they're actually really quite strong, like the Coward's Wail Shield, for example. But that's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.